Wind slams the metal door hard enough to rattle the bolts in the frame. Inside the flood control station at Piermont Harbor, red warning lights pulse across the control wall. Every few seconds the building shudders, deep, heavy vibrations rolling up from the concrete foundation like something massive striking it from below. Elias Navarro stands with one hand locked around a yellow steel lever bolted into the floor. Cold metal. Grease on his palm, the lever hasn't moved in years. Water pounds against the harbor barrier outside. The sound carries through the structure, dull, brutal, relentless. Behind him, footsteps approach across the grated floor. Slow. Confident. Elias doesn't turn. Let go of it. The voice carries cleanly over the alarms. Victor Hallberg. Elias keeps his hand on the lever. A second later, Hallberg's reflection appears in the dark control panel glass, tall coat, rain dripping from the shoulders, silver hair flattened by the storm. Two security men step in behind him, shutting the steel door against the screaming wind. The alarms continue their rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Elias finally looks back. Hallberg walks closer, calm in a room that vibrates with pressure. "You're not authorized to touch that control," Hallberg says. Elias glances at the wall of monitors. Camera feeds show the harbor through sheets of rain, white water slamming into the outer barrier, foam exploding against the rocks below Old Breakwater Wharf. Another impact shudders through the station. The overhead lights flicker. Elias tightens his grip on the lever. Hallberg notices. His mouth shifts slightly, not quite a smile. "You've already done enough damage tonight." Outside, a gust of wind howls across the harbor. The station walls groan. Elias steadies the pressure gauges. Numbers climbing. The surge regulators hum deep inside the system, metal fighting water somewhere beneath the harbor floor. Hallberg steps beside the control console. "Step away," he says. Elias doesn't move. On one of the monitors, the camera pointed toward Harbor Crown Residences flashes with lightning. Glass towers rise above the waterfront, their lights glowing faintly through the storm. Another screen shows the older docks, dark buildings packed tight along Old Breakwater Wharf. The gauges jump again. A harsh tone cuts through the room. Hallberg's security men shift behind him. Elias breathes slowly through his nose. Salt and damp concrete fill the air. "Storm surge is pushing past threshold," Elias says. Hallberg doesn't even look at the monitors. "That's not your concern anymore." Another vibration rolls through the building. Stronger. Somewhere outside, metal shrieks against metal. Elias's eyes flick back to the gauges. The red zone creeps closer. He pulls slightly on the lever. It resists, locked by years of disuse. Behind him, a shoe scrapes across the metal floor. One of Hallberg's guards steps closer. Hallberg lifts a hand without looking. The guard stops. The room falls into a tense stillness except for the alarms. Beep, beep, beep. Elias watches the storm through the camera feeds. Waves now crash high enough to spray across the outer road. The system timer begins counting down on the central screen. 2:47. Hallberg notices the display and sighs quietly. "Automatic sequence is already running," he says. Elias turns his head slightly. Sequence wasn't designed for this surge. Hallberg finally looks at the gauges. Just for a moment. Then his eyes return to Elias. "That system works exactly the way it's supposed to." Another impact rocks the station hard enough to rattle the ceiling pipes. Dust drifts down from the concrete beams. The timer continues. 2:18. Elias's fingers tighten around the lever. The yellow paint flakes under his grip. Hallberg walks closer until only a few feet separate them. Rainwater drips from his coat onto the metal floor. "You're an engineer, Navarro," he says evenly. "You understand how liability works." Elias says nothing. Wind slams against the walls again. On the monitors, water surges higher along the docks. The regulators below the harbor grow louder, deep mechanical groans vibrating through the structure. Hallberg nods toward the lever in Elias's hand. Pull that, he says, and the surge redirects. Elias watches the pressure gauge needle creep upward. The guard behind Hallberg shifts his weight. Hallberg continues calmly. And when it redirects, it doesn't go back to sea. Lightning flashes across the monitors. For a brief second, the harbor glows white. Water crashes over the outer barrier. The timer drops under 2 minutes. 1:54. Elias glances at the camera pointed toward the docks. The fishing district sits low against the waterline, rows of old buildings pressed together along the wharf. Dark. Still. Waiting. Hallberg folds his hands behind his back. Take your hand off that lever, he says quietly. Another alarm joins the others, sharper now. Elias looks at the gauges again. The surge pressure spikes suddenly. The building shudders. Hallberg's voice cuts through the noise. You should also know, he adds calmly, that flood control system was transferred to Hallberg Development this morning. Silence drops into Elias's chest like a stone. The timer continues its steady descent. 1:31. Hallberg tilts his head slightly toward the monitors showing Harbor Crown's waterfront towers. That means, he says, whatever happens tonight belongs to me. Behind them, the pressure alarm jumps to a higher pitch. The needle pushes deeper into red. Elias's grip tightens around the lever. Outside, another wave slams the harbor barrier hard enough to make the entire station tremble. And on the central screen, the automatic surge rerouting sequence begins to arm. The red warning light strobes across the control room. 01:3101:30. The automated sequence pulses on the central screen, a thin progress bar crawling forward beneath the words Surge Redirection Protocol. Elias Navarro doesn't release the lever. The yellow steel presses into his palm hard enough to ache. Across the room, Victor Hallberg watches the monitors with mild interest, as if the storm outside were a distant spectacle rather than something hammering the concrete foundation beneath their feet. Another wave slams into the harbor barrier. The station shudders. Metal piping along the ceiling rattles like bones. Elias looks back at the screen. The system diagram fills the display, pressure channels beneath Piermont Harbor glowing in blue lines that branch through the seabed like veins. One of them begins to brighten. The redirection route. Hallberg speaks without turning. You understand how hydraulics work, Navarro. Elias's jaw tightens. Outside, the wind screams across the harbor mouth. Rain blasts against the observation windows so hard the glass trembles in its frame. The guard near the door shifts his stance. Boot scraping metal. Elias studies the diagram. The surge building offshore pushes against the outer barrier gates. Normally the regulators release the pressure back toward open water. Tonight the system prepares something different. The highlighted channel bends toward shore. Toward the inner harbor. Toward the low docks. Elias reaches out with his free hand and taps a control pad. The screen changes. Camera feeds flicker across the monitors again. Old Breakwater Wharf. Weather-beaten warehouses crouch along the waterfront. Lobster traps stacked beside wooden piers. Fishing boats rock violently against their lines, masts jerking against the storm-dark sky. A green navigation buoy vanishes beneath a surge of white water. Hallberg glances briefly at the screen. His expression stays smooth. That district floods every few years, he says. They rebuild. Another tremor rolls through the building. Elias switches to a second camera. The view jumps south along the harbor. Glass towers rise from the shoreline, Harbor Crown residences. Steel and reflective windows catching the lightning in fractured flashes. The seawall protecting the complex stands higher. Newer. Reinforced. The regulators beneath the harbor hum louder. Elias pulls up the pressure mapping again. The redirection line glows brighter. He runs a calculation in his head, quick and automatic. Pressure surge, volume displacement, barrier tolerance. His fingers hover over the console. Then he taps another command. A depth model appears. Color gradients spread across the harbor floor. Blue becomes yellow, yellow creeps toward orange. Hallberg steps closer to the screen now. Curiosity, faint but real. Elias zooms in on the channel leading toward Old Breakwater Wharf. The predicted surge height updates. The number climbs. Then climbs again. The room falls quiet except for the alarms. Beep, beep, beep. Elias stares at the value. Water depth projected above dock level. Above the warehouse floors. Above the pier walkways. Another wave detonates against the outer barrier. The station lurches. Hallberg exhales slowly. You're looking at projections, he says. Storm models exaggerate. Elias switches to the tidal sensor network. Real-time readings appear along the edge of the harbor. Each buoy reports the same thing. Rising. Faster than forecast. The countdown continues. 104. On the camera feed, a small fishing trawler snaps one of its mooring lines. The vessel swings sideways, slamming against the dock hard enough to shatter a railing. Elias's hand tightens around the lever. The metal bites deeper into his palm. Hallberg notices the tension in his arm. You're about to ruin something expensive, he says quietly. Lightning explodes across the harbor. For a second, the entire waterfront turns white. Elias sees it clearly in that flash. Old Breakwater Wharf sitting low against the waterline like a shelf waiting for the tide. Harbor crown rising tall above the storm. The regulators below them groan again. A deeper vibration now. Pressure building. The system display updates. The redirection channel pulses brighter. Projected surge height jumps another foot. Then another. Elias opens the structural overlay for the wharf district. Thin lines mark the foundations beneath the wooden docks. Many of them glow yellow. Then orange. Hallberg folds his hands behind his back. You know what happens if you pull that lever, he says. Elias doesn't look at him. The numbers on the screen continue climbing. Wood structures. Salt rot. Old pilings driven into harbor mud decades ago. The simulation refreshes. Several foundations turn red. The first alarm tone changes pitch. Lower. Sharper. Hallberg's guard glances toward the monitors now. Even he can see the color change. Elias scrolls the map further along the wharf. Small houses appear behind the docks, narrow buildings pressed close together, lights flickering in the storm. The surge projection spreads through the streets behind them. Water depth rising block by block. Hallberg speaks again. Calm. Almost bored. Progress requires sacrifice. Elias stops scrolling. His hand trembles slightly against the lever. The regulators beneath the harbor roar louder. The countdown reaches the final minute. 0:58. On the control panel, a second window opens automatically. Automated pressure redirection, scheduled execution. A digital clock begins ticking down beside it. Not minutes. Nearly an hour. Enough time for the surge to keep building. Enough time for the harbor system to finish routing every ounce of that pressure straight toward Old Breakwater Wharf. Elias stares at the projection spreading across the fishing district. Street after street filling with water. The alarms echo through the station. Behind him, Hallberg watches the screen with the patience of someone who already knows the outcome. And the redirection sequence continues arming itself, step by step, preparing to send the storm directly into the heart of the harbor community. The redirection sequence continues assembling itself on the central screen. Lines of code cascade across the display as the harbor model updates in real time. Beneath it, the projection of Old Breakwater Wharf fills slowly with deepening blue. 0:57. Another wave detonates against the barrier outside. The flood control station trembles so hard the console screens flicker. Elias Navarro doesn't move. His hand still grips the yellow override lever. Across the room, Victor Hallberg studies the projection with quiet interest. The glow from the monitors washes across his face, pale blue, steady, almost clinical. Storm systems always reveal weak infrastructure, Hallberg says. Elias scrolls the pressure map again. The redirection path beneath Piermont Harbor pulses brighter. The surge channel feeding the wharf thickens as the system predicts higher volumes. Turn it off, Elias says. Hallberg doesn't answer. Instead, he leans slightly over the console, rainwater dripping from his sleeve onto the metal surface. You think you're looking at a mistake. Elias taps another diagnostic. Authorization logs appear. A list of command entries fills the screen: dates, timestamps, security credentials. The top entry flashes in red. Elias stares at the credential signature. Hallberg watches him. Keep scrolling, Hallberg says. The next authorization appears. Then another. Municipal Engineering Office. Regional Flood Authority. Infrastructure Oversight Board. Every change stamped. Logged. Confirmed. Elias's jaw tightens. Wind shrieks across the harbor outside, forcing rain through the seams of the observation window. Water beads along the glass and slides down in crooked trails. Another tremor ripples through the floor. The regulators beneath the harbor roar louder. The surge continues climbing. 051. Elias opens the command trail behind the redirection protocol. Encrypted modules unfold across the screen, layer after layer of system permissions. Someone didn't just alter a setting. They rebuilt the routing logic. He drags the log timeline backward. Weeks. Then months. Changes stacked slowly across the system. Hallberg watches the process without blinking. The guards near the door remain still, shadows against the flashing red lights. Elias stops scrolling. One entry sits buried in the chain. The credential signature reads Hallberg Infrastructure Consulting. The timestamp sits nearly 3 weeks old. Elias glances toward Hallberg. The developer tilts his head slightly. You see how careful everyone was. Another wave slams the harbor barrier. The station rocks again. Metal groans through the walls like distant thunder. Elias switches the monitor back to the harbor cameras. Old Breakwater Wharf shudders under the storm. Water already spills across the lowest dock planks. A lobster trap crate floats loose, bumping against the piling. Lightning flashes across the skyline. Harbor Crown rises behind the storm like polished glass cliffs. Hallberg's voice cuts through the alarm tones. The Harbor Commission signed off. Elias doesn't look at him. His fingers hover over the authorization list. Regional Flood Authority. City Infrastructure Board. State Environmental Compliance. Every layer stamped. Every layer official. The regulators under the harbor scream louder as pressure mounts against the outer gates. 044. Elias pulls up the engineering validation file. A simulation model appears. Projected surge impact zones. The redirection route flows through the harbor floor exactly as the system prepares to execute it. Except the damage estimates look wrong. Too low. The simulation ends with mild flooding along the wharf. Nothing structural. Nothing catastrophic. Elias zooms into the dataset feeding the model. Numbers scroll across the screen. Wave heights. Dock elevations. Foundation depths. Something shifts behind his eyes. He taps open the title reference table. The values are outdated. Years old. The new harbor depth survey never made it into the system. The projection underestimates the surge volume. By a wide margin. Elias leans closer to the screen. The real surge building offshore would push far higher than the model predicts. High enough to drown the entire wharf district. Hallberg watches quietly. You're calculating variables that were never part of the approval process, he says. Elias's hand curls into a fist against the console. Lightning cracks across the harbor again. In the camera feed, another fishing vessel breaks loose from its mooring. The boat drifts sideways through rising water before smashing against the pier. Wood splinters. The regulators howl. 038. Elias turns slowly toward Hallberg. You knew. Hallberg steadies the storm through the observation window. Rain lashes the glass so hard the outside world blurs into gray motion. A long moment passes. Then Hallberg speaks. Engineering reports are written by engineers, he says. Another silence settles into the control room. The alarms continue their relentless rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Elias's eyes drift back to the authorization log. Every agency signature remains there. Official. Permanent. Locked. The realization settles into his chest like cold iron. Even if he shuts the system down, even if he stops the surge tonight, those approvals remain. Hallberg straightens slightly. You could call someone, he says quietly. Elias looks at the communications terminal mounted beside the console. A phone line sits ready. Emergency channels blinking. Hallberg's voice remains calm. City engineers. State regulators. Anyone you want. Another wave slams the barrier hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Hallberg gestures toward the authorization log still glowing on the screen. Just remember what they'll see when they open the system records. Elias doesn't move. The alarms echo through the station. The storm outside grows louder. The countdown drops again. 032. Hallberg turns his gaze back to the surge projection flooding Old Breakwater Wharf. Then he speaks again, almost thoughtfully. Storm damage reports are very straightforward, he says. Elias watches the pressure gauge needle push deeper into the red zone. Hallberg continues, voice steady against the thunder of the regulators. Barrier stress, surge overload, infrastructure fatigue. The surge model updates again. The wharf district turns darker blue. Hallberg folds his hands behind his back. And when the investigation closes, he adds quietly, it will look exactly like an unfortunate engineering failure. The redirection sequence advances another step. And the system locks the final routing parameters into place. The redirection parameters lock into place on the central screen. A harsh confirmation tone cuts through the alarms. 031. Victor Hallberg watches the console as if the system has simply completed a routine task. Outside, the storm answers with another violent impact against the harbor barrier. The concrete walls of the flood control station shudder again, the vibration climbing through the metal floor and into Elias Navarro's legs. The surge regulators below Piermont Harbor scream with pressure. Elias stares at the screen. The projection of Old Breakwater Wharf has darkened further, water levels spreading deeper through the district streets. Another alarm joins the chorus. Higher pitched now. Closer to panic. Hallberg doesn't react. Instead, he turns slightly toward the observation window that faces the harbor mouth. Rain tears across the glass in crooked lines. Beyond it, lightning splits the sky open and reveals the black shape of the barrier wall holding back the Atlantic. For a heartbeat, the entire harbor flashes white. Elias sees the outer gates bow inward under the weight of the surge. Then darkness again. The room falls back into the rhythm of alarms and machinery. Beep, beep, beep. The sound drags somewhere deep in Elias's chest. A different noise threads through it. A long rising wail drifting across the storm. The Piermont Harbor storm sirens. Somewhere along the waterfront the warning towers have activated. The tone echoes across the water, thin at first, then louder as the wind carries it through the harbor streets. Elias's hand tightens on the lever. The sound hits him harder than the alarms. He stares at the harbor cameras again. The docks. The low buildings. Rain sweeping across wooden planks polished smooth by decades of boots and salt. For a moment the storm outside the monitors seems to blur. The siren continues its slow mournful rise. A memory moves beneath the sound. Same harbor. Same wind. Different sky. Elias standing on the breakwater years earlier, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a borrowed coat that still smelled like diesel and cold seawater. The tide had been calm that day. Fishing boats rocking lazily against the docks. Old Breakwater Wharf loud with voices and gulls. The first time he ever saw Piermont Harbor. The regulators roar beneath the floor again. The memory fractures. Back in the station, the alarms flash red across the control room walls. 027. Hallberg glances at Elias. "You hear that?" he says lightly. The sirens continue outside, their long warning cry sliding over the rooftops of the harbor district. Elias doesn't answer. Another flicker of lightning burns across the camera feeds. Water pushes higher along the docks now. One of the wooden walkways disappears completely beneath the surge. The siren keeps wailing. And the sound drags another image loose from the back of Elias's mind. The harbor years ago. A small office above a bait shop. Salt-stained windows. A blueprint spread across a wooden table. Lines and measurements sketched in thick pencil. The first design of the barrier reinforcement system. Elias younger then. Leaning over the plans while someone watched from the doorway. A rough voice behind him. "You're telling me that wall's finally going to hold?" The station shakes again. Reality slams back into place. Hallberg moves away from the console, pacing slowly across the grated floor. Elias stares at the monitors. The fishing district lies exposed beneath the rising water. But his eyes don't quite see the storm. They drift instead over details the cameras barely capture. The old cannery roof. The crooked pier lights. The faded sign above a narrow dockside building. The same places he walked through when the harbor still smelled of fresh paint and optimism. The sirens outside continue to echo. That sound had filled the air once before, too. Not tonight. Another year. Another storm warning. Elias standing near the breakwater wall with a small group of harbor workers while wind tugged at loose jackets. Someone beside him steadying the new barrier rising from the sea. A weathered face. Sun-cut lines around the eyes. Hands thick with rope burns and salt. The man had watched the construction for a long time before speaking. "You built this thing?" Elias had nodded. The man looked back at the barrier stretching across the harbor mouth. Then he said something quietly. Not a compliment. Not praise. Just trust. Back in the station, Elias's grip on the lever tightens until his knuckles pale. The regulators howl louder beneath the harbor. 023. Another surge slams the barrier. The observation window rattles violently in its frame. On the monitors, water begins spilling across the first street behind Old Breakwater Wharf. Hallberg notices the movement on the screen. He tilts his head slightly. "That district always sits too low," he says. Elias doesn't move. The sirens continue crying across Piermont Harbor. And through the storm, through the alarms, through the rising water. One memory refuses to fade. That same withered harbor worker standing beside him years earlier. Looking out at the barrier Elias helped design. Then gripping his shoulder with a rough, salt-stained hand. "Good," the man had said. A pause. Then a quiet promise placed directly into Elias's chest. Because the whole harbor is counting on it. Back in the flood control station, the surge model deepens again across Old Breakwater Wharf. The water prediction spreads through the district streets. Elias's eyes remain fixed on the screen. Because somewhere down there in the storm, in those buildings now filling with water, someone who trusted that barrier is still there. Water crawls deeper through the streets behind Old Breakwater Wharf on the projection screen. The model refreshes. Another row of buildings darkens blue. 021. The regulators beneath Piermont Harbor roar so loudly now the sound vibrates through the steel console. Elias Navarro feels it through the bones of his forearm where it presses against the control panel. Victor Hallberg watches the display with the same detached patience. The storm outside answers with another brutal strike against the barrier wall. The flood control station shudders again, lights flickering. The harbor sirens continue their slow, mournful cry across the waterfront. Elias keeps staring at the district map. Street names appear in small white text. Gull Row, Anchor Lane. Fisherman's Court. The water prediction spreads across them like ink and wet paper. His hand still grips the yellow override lever. The metal feels warmer now, slick with sweat. Hallberg's voice drifts across the room. You're studying projections like they're memories. Elias doesn't respond. Because the harbor below the storm isn't just geometry on a screen. The lines of those streets pull something deeper out of him. Gull Row. He remembers walking there once with a hard hat tucked under his arm. Wind pushing salt spray off the harbor wall. The first time the barrier project had reached the foundation stage. The docks had been crowded that morning. Fishermen leaning against railings, boots resting on coils of rope. Watching the construction barges inch across the harbor mouth. Elias younger then. Still carrying rolled blueprints under one arm. Someone had stopped him halfway down the pier. Engineer. A rough voice cutting through the wind. Elias had turned. A tall man with a beard the color of rust stood beside a stack of lobster traps. Oil-stained jacket. Hands thick and scarred from years of hauling lines. The man had pointed toward the distant wall rising from the sea. That thing actually going to stop the Atlantic? Back in the flood control station, another alarm joins the others. A deeper tone. Pressure building faster. 018. The memory sharpens. Elias standing there on the pier with the wind tearing at the blueprint sheets in his hands. He had unrolled them across a crate. Showed the fishermen the structure. Reinforced gates. Pressure chambers. Surge regulators buried under the harbor floor. The man had listened in silence. Then he gave a single nod. That wall holds, he had said, and this whole town sleeps easier. The regulators beneath the station howl louder now. Elias drags his focus back to the present. The surge projection continues creeping inland across the district. Hallberg glances toward the harbor cameras. One of the piers collapses under the pounding water. Wood planks break apart and scatter across the surface like driftwood. Hallberg exhales softly. Old structures fail first. Elias doesn't move. The projection updates again. Another street floods. Another cluster of buildings. The sirens outside continue echoing through the storm. That sound pulls another fragment loose. Anchor Lane. Elias remembers the smell there. Diesel engines. Wet rope. Fresh fish laid out on steel tables under buzzing fluorescent lights. He had spent weeks down there during the barrier project. Not in offices. On the docks. Checking tide markers. Measuring foundation depths. The fishermen had watched him with cautious curiosity at first. Then gradually with something else. One afternoon the same bearded fisherman had handed him a cup of black coffee in a chipped mug. They stood together beside the water while waves slapped gently against the pier. The man had pointed toward the barrier rising in the distance. You the one who figured out those surge regulators? Elias had nodded. The fisherman had taken a long drink. Good. Nothing more. Just that. Back in the station, lightning flashes across the harbor cameras again. For a split second, Old Breakwater Wharf glows white under the storm. The water level is higher now. Dock roofs almost touching the surge. 015. Hallberg studies the numbers calmly. You designed parts of this system, he says. Elias says nothing. The regulators below them scream louder. Hallberg gestures at the console. You know exactly how impressive it is. Another violent tremor shakes the station. Dust drifts down from the ceiling beams. Elias watches the projection map shift again. The redirection route under the harbor pulses brighter. That part of the system had been his. Not the barrier wall itself. The regulators. The pressure logic. He had redesigned them when the early models failed stress tests. Weeks of calculations. Endless nights staring at simulation data while the rest of Piermont Harbor slept. He had finally cracked it. A new routing method. Surge pressure diverted safely back toward the open Atlantic. When the prototype test succeeded, the engineers in the control room had erupted. Applause echoing off concrete walls. Back then the system meant protection. Back then the barrier meant something else entirely. Hallberg's voice cuts into the memory. And now you're considering destroying the crown jewel of Piermont's waterfront. Elias glances toward the harbor cameras showing harbor crown residences. The glass towers stand untouched behind their reinforced seawall. Every inch of that complex built directly behind the protection his system created. Years of work. Awards. Articles in engineering journals. The project that turned Elias Navarro from an unknown structural engineer into something the industry noticed. Hallberg watches him carefully. Pull that lever, Hallberg says quietly, and harbor crown floods. Elias's grip tightens again. The regulators scream beneath the harbor. 012. His career lives inside this system. Every calculation. Every line of code. Every reinforcement embedded into the harbor floor. Destroying the towers behind the barrier wouldn't just damage property. It would bury the work that built his reputation. Hallberg folds his hands again. Think about what happens after tonight. Another surge crashes against the barrier wall. The station rattles violently. The projection updates again. Old Breakwater Wharf sinks deeper under the simulated water. Elias stares at the screen. The streets. The docks. The same places where those fishermen once leaned over his blueprints. Where that bearded harbor worker had trusted the barrier he built. A faint flicker appears in Elias's mind. Not years ago. Not a memory softened by time. Something recent. Days ago. A quiet moment in this same control station. Elias standing alone at the console late at night while routine diagnostics ran through the system. A single line in the configuration file catching his eye. Routing parameters. Different. Subtle. But wrong. The memory sharpens. The moment he opened the deeper system logs and saw the surge redirection code had been changed. The moment he opened the deeper system logs and saw the surge redirection code had been changed. The memory slams into him with the same cold clarity as the storm hammering the harbor. The regulators beneath Piermont Harbor scream louder. 011. Victor Hallberg stands beside the console, calm as ever, watching the projection map where Old Breakwater Wharf continues drowning in slow digital certainty. Elias Navarro doesn't answer him. Because the memory unfolding in his mind isn't speculation. It's proof. Days earlier. Same control room. Same steel consoles glowing under dim fluorescent light. But the harbor outside had been quiet then. No storm. No sirens. Only the distant creak of moored fishing boats drifting with the tide. Routine diagnostics had been running across the system. Green bars. Stable pressures. Normal operations. Elias had almost left. Then a small anomaly appeared on the regulator routing panel. Just a flicker. One parameter in the surge distribution logic reading slightly outside its expected range. At first it looked harmless. Calibration drift. A minor adjustment after a firmware update. But Elias had written most of that code himself. And the numbers felt wrong. Back in the present, another violent impact slams into the harbor barrier. The observation window shutters. Rain lashes the glass. 010. Elias's jaw tightens. On the monitors, the projection refreshes again. Water spreads deeper across Fisherman's Court. Hallberg watches the update with detached curiosity. Storm models aren't emotional, he says. They're mathematics. Elias's mind returns to the control room days earlier. He had leaned closer to the screen, scrolled through the regulator firmware history. A long list of updates and patches. Most routine. But one modification stood out. 2 weeks ago. Routing override logic rewritten. Small changes. Subtle enough to hide inside a standard maintenance patch. But the effect was unmistakable. The surge regulators no longer distributed pressure evenly across the harbor gates. They redirected it, concentrated it, guided the force toward one section of coastline. Old Breakwater Wharf. Back in the present, the sirens outside wail louder through the storm. The regulators beneath the harbor roar like engines pushed past their limits. 009. Hallberg glances at Elias again. You built this system, he says quietly. You know how elegant it is. Elias doesn't respond. Because elegance isn't what he saw in those logs. He had opened the simulation engine, fed the altered parameters into the surge model, watched the results form on the screen. Pressure curves rising, water levels climbing, the storm energy bypassing stronger barrier sections, and slamming straight into the lowest elevation district in Piermont Harbor. Old Breakwater Wharf. The exact neighborhood filled with aging docks, small homes, bait shops, and fishermen who had trusted the barrier when it rose from the sea. Elias had stared at the projection in silence. The room back then smelled faintly of machine oil and stale coffee. Outside, the harbor had been calm. Inside, something colder had settled in his chest. Back in the flood control station, another alarm cuts through the noise. A sharp electronic pulse. 008. The model refreshes again. The blue water projection climbs higher through Gull Row. Hallberg folds his arms. You're hesitating, he observes. Elias keeps staring at the console. But his mind moves again through the chain of discoveries. After seeing the altered surge logic, he had searched the authorization records. Every system change requires clearance. A digital signature. An engineering supervisor. Someone accountable. He had opened the maintenance log. Scrolled down. Found the authorization line. The entry looked official. Stamped. Verified. But the name attached to it wasn't one of the Harbor Authority engineers. It belonged to an external contractor. A systems consultant assigned during Harbor Crown's final construction phase. Elias had felt a slow pressure build behind his ribs. Something wasn't right. He exported the logs. Saved copies. Ran deeper diagnostics. Everything confirmed the same conclusion. The regulators weren't malfunctioning. They were obeying instructions. Instructions designed to push storm pressure directly toward Old Breakwater Wharf. The regulators howl louder beneath the harbor floor. Back in the present, the entire control station trembles. Dust shakes loose from a ceiling vent. 007. Hallberg watches the projection quietly. Almost thoughtfully. You know what fascinates me about infrastructure, he says. Elias doesn't look at him. Hallberg gestures toward the harbor monitors. People assume systems are neutral. Lightning explodes across the sky outside. For a split second, Harbor Crown's glass towers gleam like knives against the black storm. Elias's grip on the override lever tightens. His mind moves forward again. The next morning after discovering the altered code, he had taken the evidence straight to the Harbor Authority office. Stacked printed logs on a conference table. Explained the surge rerouting. The room had been quiet. Officials flipping through pages. Expressions tightening. One of them promised it would be investigated. Elias left believing something would be done. Days passed. Nothing changed. He checked the system again. The altered firmware remained active. He sent formal reports. Filed complaints through engineering oversight channels. Attached simulation data. Risk projections. Warnings about Old Breakwater Wharf. The responses arrived slowly. Short emails. Administrative language. Under review. Pending verification. Maintenance team notified. But the system never changed back. The altered routing remained. Back in the control station, the regulators scream again. 006. The surge projection swells across the harbor district. Old Breakwater Wharf nearly submerged on the model now. Hallberg tilts his head slightly. Still thinking about it? Elias breathes slowly through his nose. The smell of heated electronics fills the control room. His mind returns to the final step he took days earlier. The moment frustration hardened into certainty. He opened the contractor authorization file again. Traced the digital signature attached to the firmware update. Looked deeper into the company behind it. A development consultancy. Infrastructure optimization specialists. Recently awarded several support contracts connected to the Harbor Crown waterfront expansion. Elias had followed the corporate registry links. Ownership filings. Partner agreements. Investment disclosures. A name appearing repeatedly inside those documents. The same name now standing beside him in the control room. Victor Hallberg. Another surge slams the barrier wall. The station shudders violently. 005. On the projection screen, Old Breakwater Wharf disappears beneath simulated floodwater. Elias slowly lifts his eyes from the console. And finally looks directly at Hallberg. Elias Navarro slowly lifts his eyes from the console. And finally looks directly at Victor Hallberg. The regulators beneath Piermont Harbor scream through the steel floor like engines tearing themselves apart. 005. On the projection screen, Old Breakwater Wharf lies buried under deep blue floodwater. Street names vanish beneath the simulated surge. Gull Row. Anchor Lane. Fisherman's Court. All gone. Hallberg meets Elias's gaze without flinching. Rain lashes the observation window behind him. Lightning flashes across the harbor, briefly illuminating the black curve of the barrier wall fighting the Atlantic. Then darkness again. The sirens outside continue their long, hollow cry. Elias's voice is quiet when it comes. You altered the regulators. Hallberg tilts his head slightly. Not denial. Not surprise. Just acknowledgement. The control room hums with electrical heat and vibrating metal. For a moment, Hallberg simply studies the projection map again, watching the digital flood swallow the harbor district Elias once walked every morning. Then he exhales slowly. The system performs exactly as designed. Another surge slams into the barrier. The entire station shudders. 004. Elias's grip tightens around the yellow override lever. The metal bites into his palm. You redirected the pressure. Hallberg folds his hands behind his back and strolls a few steps toward the observation window. Outside, the harbor boils beneath the storm. The fishing boats along the docks jerk violently against their mooring lines. You're an engineer, Hallberg says calmly. You understand structural compromise. Lightning splits the sky again. For an instant Harbor Crown rises behind the storm like a fortress of glass towers. Unflooded. Untouched. Elias watches Hallberg's reflection in the dark glass. You're flooding Old Breakwater Wharf to protect your development. Hallberg doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he watches the storm for several seconds. Rain streaks down the window like long silver threads. Behind them, the regulators howl louder. The projection updates again. Water spreads deeper into the district. Hallberg finally turns back toward the console. The harbor is changing, he says. His tone carries the quiet certainty of someone discussing weather patterns. Cities evolve. Shorelines shift. Economies transform. Elias feels heat climbing through his chest. That's where people live. Hallberg gestures toward the flooded projection. Fishing docks. Decaying warehouses. Wooden piers built 60 years ago. Another alarm begins pulsing through the control room. A lower, more urgent tone. 003. Hallberg steps closer to the console. The truth, he says quietly, is that Piermont Harbor cannot remain frozen in time. Elias stares at him. Images flicker through his mind. The bearded fisherman handing him coffee beside the docks. The smell of diesel engines drifting through Anchor Lane. Children running along the pier railings while gulls screamed overhead. Those weren't relics. Those were lives. Hallberg continues, voice smooth. Harbor Crown represents the future of this coastline. He gestures again toward the glass towers visible through the storm. Economic expansion. Tourism. Investment. Lightning flashes again. The towers gleam cold and perfect behind their seawall, untouched by the rising water. Hallberg's eyes settle on Elias. The fishing district occupies land that will eventually redevelop anyway. The regulators roar louder beneath the harbor floor. Elias feels the vibration climb through the soles of his boots. People are still there, he says. Hallberg's expression doesn't change. Yes. Just that. The word hangs in the control room like a stone dropped into still water. Silence settles for a moment. Only alarms. Only machinery. Only the distant thunder rolling across the harbor. Elias's jaw tightens. You engineered this storm path. Hallberg steadies him calmly. No. Another pause. I merely ensured the city's most valuable infrastructure remains protected. 002. The projection screen flashes red along the system margins. A warning banner scrolls across the console display. The regulators scream louder. Hallberg glances at the alert briefly. Then back at Elias. You're considering pulling that lever. Not a question. A statement. Elias doesn't answer. Hallberg's gaze sharpens slightly. You should think carefully about the consequences. The station shakes again under another violent wave impact. The alarms pulse faster. You've built your entire career on this barrier system, Hallberg continues quietly. Your regulator architecture. Your pressure routing models. He gestures toward the console. If Harbor Crown floods tonight, investigators will ask how. Lightning flashes again. For a moment Elias sees his own reflection in the monitor glass. Wet hair. Salt spray clinging to his jacket. Eyes burning with something deeper than fear. Hallberg's voice drops lower. You'll be blamed for overriding a stable system. The words settle slowly. Cold. Precise. You'll lose your engineering license. Another alarm begins sounding. High-pitched. Urgent. You'll face civil lawsuits from every investor tied to Harbor Crown. Hallberg's eyes hold his. Financially, that could follow you for the rest of your life. The regulators beneath the harbor roar like collapsing engines. Elias feels the weight of the lever in his hand. Years of work. Years of reputation. Everything he built rising from the calculations that made this system possible. All of it balanced on the decision waiting inside his grip. Outside the window, the harbor boils beneath the storm. Somewhere beyond the rain and darkness, Old Breakwater Wharf still stands. For now. The control room falls silent for one long breath. Neither man speaks. Only the alarms. Only the storm. Then the console screen flashes bright red. A new message spreads across the display. 001. The regulators scream as the system prepares to redirect the full force of the Atlantic toward Old Breakwater Wharf. The console screen flashes bright red. 001. The regulators beneath Piermont Harbor erupt into a metallic scream that vibrates through the bones of the flood control station. Elias Navarro feels the vibration climb through the lever in his hand. Victor Hallberg doesn't move. Outside the observation window, the Atlantic hammers the barrier wall again. Lightning fractures the sky, and for one violent heartbeat the entire harbor glows white. Then darkness. On the projection map, Old Breakwater Wharf lies completely submerged beneath the predicted surge path. The system is ready. Waiting. The automatic reroute timer blinks once more. 001. Hallberg's voice remains quiet. You still have time to step away. Elias keeps staring at the screen. The sirens across Piermont Harbor wail through the storm. He hears them echo through the harbor streets. Through Gull Row. Through Anchor Lane. Through the narrow docks where fishing boats grind against their ropes in rising water. Hallberg folds his arms. You've already filed complaints, he says. The words land softly inside the chaos of alarms. You documented the firmware change. You reported the surge routing. Another brutal wave crashes into the barrier. The station shudders. You did your duty, Hallberg continues calmly. Elias feels the lever tremble in his grip. The yellow metal bar is cold despite the heat of his hand. You walked through the proper channels, Hallberg says. You sent the warnings. Hallberg's eyes settle on him again. No one listened. The regulators scream louder beneath the harbor floor. The system clock flickers. Midnight. The console screen pulses red. A long breath fills Elias's lungs. Then slowly leaves. Hallberg speaks again. If you override the system now, he says quietly, you destroy Harbor Crown's protection basin. Elias knows the layout without looking. The underground seawall beneath the glass towers. The reinforced pressure chambers. The drainage corridors that keep the complex dry during storms. The manual override would reverse the regulator routing. The Atlantic's force would slam directly into that basin. The structure would flood. Fast. Hallberg's voice remained steady. $3 billion of waterfront development. Lightning flashes again. The towers of Harbor Crown glow behind the rain like distant blades. Hallberg watches Elias carefully. Every investor will come for you. The regulators roar like collapsing machinery. You'll lose your license. The sirens outside climb higher in pitch. You'll face criminal negligence investigations. Water pounds against the barrier wall. You'll spend the rest of your life fighting lawsuits. Elias closes his eyes for one brief second. Inside the darkness behind his eyelids. The harbor returns. Not the storm. The quiet mornings years earlier. Fishing boats drifting in pale sunlight. Diesel engines coughing awake. The smell of salt and rope and fresh paint. The bearded fisherman standing beside the pier railing. Holding a chipped mug of coffee. You built this thing? Elias had nodded. A rough hand gripping his shoulder. Good. The memory lingers. Just one breath longer. Because the whole harbor is counting on it. The control room shakes again. Metal groans somewhere beneath the floor. Elias opens his eyes. The projection screen flickers violently. Old Breakwater Wharf still drowned beneath the model. He imagines the real streets beneath the storm. The narrow wooden docks. The bait shops. The houses leaning toward the water after decades of salt wind. Lights glowing behind rain-streaked windows. People listening to the sirens. Waiting. Hallberg speaks again. One district disappears, he says quietly. The city adapts. His eyes remain calm. History moves forward. The words settle between them. The alarms pulse faster. Elias's hand tightens around the lever. His knuckles whiten. The metal bar resists slightly under the pressure. Years of engineering calculations live inside this system. Every regulator beneath the harbor. Every routing algorithm. Every safety redundancy. His name is attached to it. His reputation. His future. Everything balanced on this one mechanical hinge. Another surge detonates against the barrier wall. The control room rattles violently. The screen flashes again. The regulators begin to shift. Elias feels the vibration change beneath his boots. The system is starting. The Atlantic's force preparing to drive straight into Old Breakwater Wharf. Hallberg watches him carefully now. "You still have time," he says. For a moment. Elias doesn't move. The room fills with alarms. With thunder. With the grinding scream of machinery straining against the ocean. Then, silence inside him. A single clear thought cutting through everything else. Not about Harbor Crown. Not about lawsuits. Not about the license hanging on the wall of his office. Just the harbor. Just the docks. Just the people who once leaned over his blueprints while gulls circled above the tide. Trusting the barrier he helped build. Elias's fingers tighten around the lever. Hallberg sees the movement. For the first time tonight, something flickers in his expression. Not fear. Recognition. He knows what is about to happen. The system clock flashes again. The regulators howl as the routing sequence begins locking into place. The moment is closing. The choice shrinking. The lever feels heavier now. As if the entire harbor is hanging from it. Elias exhales slowly. His arm moves. Metal scrapes against the locking bracket. Hallberg's voice cuts sharply through the alarms. "Elias." The lever drops. Hard. A violent mechanical snap echoes through the control room as the manual override slams fully into place. The lever drops. The violent metallic snap ricochets through the flood control station like a gunshot. For half a heartbeat nothing moves. Then the regulators beneath Piermont Harbor scream. Not the strained howl from moments earlier. Something deeper. Something shifting. The steel floor jolts under Elias Navarro's boots as hydraulic gates begin slamming through emergency positions deep beneath the harbor bed. Red warning lights flood the control room. Manual override engaged. The system clock blinks violently. Victor Hallberg turns his head toward the console. Not panic. Calculation. On the projection screen, the surge routing map fractures. Blue currents across Old Breakwater Wharf flicker. Pause. Then reverse. New pressure lines erupt across the digital harbor like lightning veins beneath the surface. Elias watches the reroute propagate through the system architecture he built years ago. The Atlantic surge slams into the barrier again. But the regulators respond differently now. Deep beneath the harbor floor, enormous valves rotate. Steel gates open. Pressure corridors realign. The redirected force begins driving toward a different basin. Harbor Crown. Outside the observation window, lightning splits the sky again. For a second, the glass towers stand brilliant against the black storm. Then the harbor beneath them explodes. A violent surge surges through the underground drainage tunnels protecting the development complex. The lower seawall chambers vanish under white foam. Water erupts through service vents along the waterfront promenade. Elias sees it on the harbor cameras. Parking levels. Maintenance corridors. Subterranean loading docks. All swallowed as the basin floods under the redirected surge. Back in the control room, alarms scream louder. Pressure diversion active. Hallberg exhales once. Long. Slow. His eyes return to the projection map. Across the screen, the surge prediction begins changing again. Old Breakwater Wharf. The deep blue flood layer fades slightly. Pressure curves flatten. The barrier wall along that district stabilizes under the new load distribution. Elias feels it through the floor. The vibration pattern shifts. Still violent. But balanced. The regulators hold. Another massive wave crashes against the barrier mouth. The entire station groans. Yet the system absorbs it. On the projection screen, the surge line creeping through Gull Row hesitates. Stops. Then slowly begins retreating from the district grid. Old Breakwater Wharf holds. For now. The sirens outside continue wailing through the storm, but beneath the alarms something else settles inside the room. A thin, fragile stability. Elias's grip loosens on the lever. His palm is slick with sweat. He doesn't move. Doesn't speak. Across the harbor cameras the consequences spread through Harbor Crown. Water surges through underground access ramps. Security lights flicker inside flooded maintenance corridors. An emergency barrier gate slams shut along the base of one tower as seawater churns against the concrete walls. Millions of gallons forcing their way into infrastructure that was never meant to absorb the full Atlantic surge. Hallberg watches it all. Silent. His reflection flickers across the dark monitors. Elias finally lifts his eyes toward the projection screen again. Old Breakwater Wharf. The fishing district still stands. Docks battered by rain. Buildings shaking under the wind. But not buried beneath the wall of water that had been seconds away from swallowing them. The regulators continue roaring under the harbor floor. But the pressure holds. For the first time tonight, the system stabilizes. A long moment passes. Only alarms. Only storm. Then Hallberg walks slowly toward the console. His shoes scrape softly across the metal floor grating. He stops beside the display panel and steadies the system log scrolling across the screen. New entries appear line by line. Timestamp. Override command chain. Pressure redirection confirmation. The entire sequence recorded in perfect digital clarity. Hallberg reads it all. Carefully. The alarm softens slightly as the surge begins distributing across the harbor defenses. Old Breakwater Wharf remains above water on the live camera feed. Elias watches the district through sheets of rain. Fishing boats still thrashing at their lines. Pier lights flickering. But the docks remain visible. Still there. Still breathing. A strange quiet settles inside his chest. Not peace. Something thinner. More fragile. Behind him Hallberg's voice breaks the silence. You realize, he says quietly, this log records everything. Elias doesn't turn. The storm batters the barrier wall again. The regulators answer. Holding. Hallberg continues steadying the screen. You bypassed a fully automated flood control sequence. His finger taps lightly against the log entry showing the manual lever command. Every investor tied to Harbor Crown will see this. Another wave detonates against the barrier mouth. The station trembles. But the system absorbs it again. Elias exhales slowly. Across the harbor the fishing district survives another surge. Hallberg steps away from the console. For a moment he simply watches the storm through the observation window. Rain streaks across the glass. Lightning flashes across the Atlantic. Then he speaks again. Soft. Almost conversational. The storm will pass. Elias keeps staring toward Old Breakwater Wharf. Hallberg's voice continues behind him. And when it does, a pause. Just long enough for the words to settle. The real consequences will begin. Rain continues striking the observation window long after Victor Hallberg's words settle into the control room. The storm is still there. The Atlantic still throws its weight against the barrier wall outside Piermont Harbor. But the violence has changed. The regulators beneath the harbor floor no longer scream the way they did minutes earlier. Their sound has settled into a deep mechanical roar, steady, balanced, enduring the pressure instead of fighting it blindly. Elias Navarro stands beside the console without moving. His hand still rests on the yellow lever. It remains locked in the down position. Across the monitors the harbor cameras stream live images through sheets of rain. Harbor Crown glows with emergency lighting. Water surges through the lower service levels beneath the towers. Parking entrances have become narrow rivers pushing against steel containment gates. Maintenance corridors are already lost to the flood basin. The development still stands. But it no longer looks untouchable. Elias's eyes move to another camera feed. Old Breakwater Wharf. Rain pours across the crooked roofs and wooden docks. Fishing boats pitch violently in their slips. Waves slap against the pylons hard enough to make the whole district shudder. But the streets are still there. Gull Row. Anchor Lane. Fisherman's Court. Water floods the lowest steps along the harbor edge, but it does not surge deeper. The barrier holds. The regulators hold. The harbor holds. For now. Behind him, Victor Hallberg stands in silence. He no longer watches the screen. Instead, his reflection lingers faintly in the dark observation glass, looking out toward the storm-dark Atlantic beyond the barrier wall. The alarms in the control room begin changing tone. The urgent shriek fades into slower warning pulses. Stabilization protocols. Containment mode. Elias hears the shift immediately. He helped design those systems years ago. The room smells faintly of heated circuitry and salt carried in through the station vents. Outside, thunder rolls farther away now. Still dangerous. But moving. Elias finally removes his hand from the lever. The skin across his palm is pale where the metal pressed into it. He flexes his fingers once. They tremble slightly. On the system log screen, the override entry continues blinking quietly. The letters look small, but permanent. Hallberg steps closer to the console. Not hurried. Not angry. Just observant. He reads the entry again without touching the keyboard. Another camera feed cycles across the main monitor. Emergency crews move through the Harbor Crown Promenade under rain-soaked floodlights. Workers attempt to seal drainage gates while water pushes through the lower access corridors. Lights flicker across the glass towers. The district survives. But something inside it has broken. Elias watches the scene without speaking. Across the harbor, the fishing district remains dark except for scattered pier lamps struggling against the storm wind. One of the cameras shakes as another wave slams the breakwater rocks near Gull Row. Still, the docks remain. The same crooked planks. The same battered pilings. The same harbor he once walked through with rolled blueprints under his arm while fishermen leaned against railings and watched the barrier rising from the sea. The station grows quieter as the system stabilizes further. Not silent. Just less frantic. Hallberg turns his head slightly toward Elias. For a moment neither man speaks. Then Hallberg steps away from the console. His shoes move across the steel floor grating with a slow, measured rhythm. He stops beside the observation window. The rain distorts the harbor lights beyond the glass. Far out at the harbor mouth, the barrier wall still faces the open Atlantic. Black. Immovable. Elias follows the line of it with his eyes. Years ago he had stood on the breakwater rocks watching that structure rise piece by piece against the tide. Steel cages. Concrete pours. Survey lines stretching across the water. Back then the harbor had been quiet. Workers shouting measurements through the wind. Gulls circling overhead. Someone handing him a chipped mug of coffee while asking if the wall would really hold. The regulators beneath the harbor hum steadily now. Elias watches the storm moving across the water. Behind him the system log continues recording. Each adjustment. Each pressure change. Each command line. The evidence accumulating quietly inside the machine. Hallberg remains at the window. His voice, when it comes, is almost lost beneath the distant thunder. The storm passes, he says. Elias does not turn. Rain slides down the glass in slow crooked paths. Beyond it, Piermont Harbor endures the night. The barrier stands against the Atlantic. The docks of Old Breakwater Wharf remain in the dark. And somewhere inside the flood control system, the truth waits, still written in the code that has not yet been erased.